Okay, so Rousseau, the Discourse on Inequality, Part 2. So basically, the sort of overview, there are three basic sort of stages or eras of human development or human history, according to Rousseau. The first stage is the state of nature, and that's what he spends all of basically most or all of Part 1 discussing, explaining. This is what human beings are like by nature, in the state of nature before they were developed at all, before they changed themselves at all. That's the first stage, natural humanity, the state of nature. Human beings as they existed at the very beginning in the state of nature. The second stage, which he describes here at the beginning of Part 2, is this sort of first form of communal life, this sort of first stage of society, where human beings came together, they lived, they had families, they had a few other social bonds, but it was still relatively undeveloped. There was no real inequality, there was no private property, there was no real hierarchy, no real law, nothing like that. So it was communal life, but it was still something very basic, kind of tribal, or maybe not even fully tribal in terms of organization and so on. That's the second stage of human history as a whole. The first stage of communal life or of society. And then the third stage, the final stage, is once you have private property, and then eventually the creation of law, and then society in the sense in which we know it, and society in the sense in which it's existed for pretty much all of written or recorded human history, and that for Rousseau is the worst part. He actually says here in this part that we'll read, or that this lecture will cover, that second stage of human history, that first stage of communal life, that first form of communal life was the best, was the happiest. The final stage, human beings in society with law, with private property, with clear inequalities, that is the worst, the most unhappy, the most unnatural, and therefore just the worst overall for Rousseau. So starting with Part 2, that's sort of the overview of human history, of human development overall for Rousseau. Part 2 sort of starts, remember, Part 1 left off with him describing man in the state of nature, describing human beings in the state of nature, and then at the very end saying, okay, so now I have to sort of describe how we came to change, how we came from this original state in which we had no sociability at all, no family, no language, no reason or need to communicate with one another, and human beings, again, he says, in this first state of nature, this completely untouched natural condition of human beings were obviously concerned with their own self-preservation, and they had a kind of natural pity, and they were not naturally cruel or aggressive or anything like that. So at the end he says, okay, so now let's talk about the development. How did things change? And at the very beginning of Part 2, he starts by sort of explaining the overall, the great, fatal, permanent change that happened in human history. So Part 2 begins, Rousseau says, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of land, thought of saying, this is mine, and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, murders, how much misery and horror the human race would have been spared if someone had pulled up the stakes and filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to everyone, and that the earth itself belongs to no one. So for Rousseau, the sort of the founding, the institution of private property is sort of the fatal turning point. But as we talked about in a previous lecture, it's not so much as you might think, because property makes people too devoted to property, makes them too acquisitive or too possessive, and they start to become too concerned with property. The real key is that as people claim parts of the earth for themselves and therefore claim that as their own private property, other people then don't have any land, don't have any land, and therefore don't have any access to crops and to food and so on, and therefore they become dependent on the people who do own the land for absolute necessities like food. And Rousseau says when you have that dependence, when you have one person absolutely needs to rely on another person for something essential like food, then you have the loss of freedom, and when you have the loss of freedom, you have the loss of natural equality. And therefore you have the institution of inequality, and that changes everything. And that's what makes human life so miserable in society, according to Rousseau, is in fact inequality. So Discourse on Inequality, that was of course the question posed by the Academy that he's answered. But as it turns out, Rousseau says, this inequality is sort of the root of all evil. And again, inequality comes from the loss of natural freedom. And so he'll spell all this out. He'll explain all this. He'll detail how all of this happened in a kind of historical narrative here in Part 2 of the Discourse. So as he goes on, so he says, okay, let me explain how this happened, and he sort of returns to the idea of the state of nature, and the way he describes it here in part 2, it's not quite maybe as plentiful as he had suggested in part 1. The way he describes it here is not so much that people were just walking around, had very little trouble at all getting food or anything else that they needed. In fact, he says it was often difficult. They were competing with other animals. They were having to fend them off. They were having to reach fruit and trees that was too high for them, and so on. He does make a point to say that they were still rarely competing with each other. So he does still say that even if the state of nature was more difficult than he had suggested earlier, that doesn't mean that it was a state of competition, much less war. Occasionally human beings had to compete with each other over food, but it was rarely, and it was not a sort of definitive aspect of their life there. But they did have to do a lot of other things. They had to try to catch fish, they had to try to get food out of trees, they had to deal with other animals. So he says basically human beings started to make tools, even make clothes, and eventually even to use fire. So he says this is sort of how human beings began to change, how that very first relatively small step out of the state of nature was basically human beings started making tools. They sharpened a stick and used it to spear a fish. Or even more basically, they picked up a stick and used it to knock a coconut out of a tree, or threw a rock and used it to knock a fruit out of a tree. And so he says that's the first most basic thing, that they started to use tools. And then as they started to do that, their minds started to develop very, very slowly as they began to have a sense of objects, something external to them. And then from there, they began to be able to have very, very crude, very, very basic concepts as they started to evaluate other things. So maybe they pick up a stick and they say, how strong is it? Not using language, of course, because they didn't have that yet, but they begin to have a sense of, if I need to use a stick as a weapon, I want one that's relatively thick, relatively strong. Again, not using language for any of this, but they began to sort of make comparisons between different sticks and say, and realize, okay, this one is stronger. And so from there, as they started to use these tools and started to use them to deal with other animals, to kill them or to fight them off or whatever, Rousseau says there was this first experience of pride. So the very first sort of human activity that moved us out of the state of nature was the creation of tools, and that was simply for the sake of self-preservation. That was simply for utility, for making it easier for us to feed ourselves, to fend off dangerous animals, and so on. So it was purely for the sake of self-preservation and making our lives easier. However, shortly after that, human beings began to experience pride. They began to sort of feel superior to the other animals as they realized, I can make these tools, these other animals can't. So that very first step out was to make tools, basically to get food and so on, but then pride followed very shortly on that. The first human experience of pride and the first sense of being somehow different than and better than the rest of the animals. And then as he goes on, he explains, he says, and also as human beings could, rarely would they compete, and sometimes they realized that that there would be, a very temporary partnership or cooperation would be helpful. So the example he gives is maybe they realize if 5 of us get together in a circle and close around a deer, we can all kill the deer and then we can split the meat between the 5 of us. But he says still there was no sense of justice here. If one of them, if a rabbit ran by and he could grab the rabbit and eat that, he would go and do that. And then of course once he gets the rabbit, the deer can just escape from where he isn't, from where he's disappeared. And Rousseau says he didn't feel bad. He didn't think he had done anything wrong by grabbing the rabbit for himself. He didn't think anything of it. So Rousseau says there were these very basic partnerships, but they were purely temporary. There was no sense of justice involved. It was just sort of, well, maybe if we cooperate, we can get this. But if somebody didn't cooperate, oh well. So this was the beginning of sort of very, very basic human interaction, very basic human partnerships and cooperation and so on, but nothing extensive, nothing permanent, nothing very serious. Eventually, Rousseau says, along with this, people are building tools, and eventually they started to realize that they could build huts, that they could build, shelters. It would be nicer to sleep in a hut than it would to sleep under a tree or in a cave or something. So he says they began to build huts, they began to build buildings of some sort. This was the beginning, obviously, then of settled life. And Rousseau says, probably not entirely clear why, but he says, probably the strongest people would be the first one to build huts. Therefore, it would have been difficult to attack them, so people would just imitate them. Rather than fight over the hut, just go build your own. It's not extremely advanced engineering or anything. It would have been easy enough to figure out what that person had done, pile up some rocks or something. So people would just imitate them and build their own huts. And then he says, so then you have a group of people living together. And he says, as for those who already had huts or who already had houses, they would never attack somebody else to try to take their house, because first of all, what's the point? Why would you need two huts or two houses in this situation? You wouldn't. So human beings wouldn't be aggressive, they wouldn't be acquisitive in that way. They have no reason to take somebody else's hut once they already have one. And as he puts it, they could expect a very lively fight with the family which occupied it. So there's no reason for there to be conflict over these huts, Rousseau says. You come up, there's a strong person who's already built one, you decide you're not going to fight them, you just imitate them, and then once people have huts, there's no reason to take someone else's and try to become wealthy in that way, because Rousseau says there's simply no use. There's nothing that you can do with the second hut. So again, he's saying at this stage people are living together, but there's still very little competition. There's still very little conflict. People are not fighting over these huts. They're simply imitating, building their own, and then everybody's content with their own hut, because nothing is useful about having two huts to move back and forth between. Why would you do that? Now, once people start to live together like this, you have another, in some ways, the most significant of these changes. You have the beginning of family life. Human beings start to come together, and rather than just these momentary meetings in the state of nature that he described, where a male and female come together, breed, and then leave and never see each other again, now you have basically families forming, and there's a kind of permanent attachment. And so people pair off, and they probably weren't wedding ceremonies or anything, but they become couples, and they raise their own children. So Rousseau says, you have, as he puts it, the sweetest sentiments known to man, conjugal love and paternal love. So Rousseau says at this first stage, people are living together now, and you start to have conjugal love, romantic love. Again, a fairly simple form, but actual love for another person, for another adult, and then love for your offspring, love for your children. And Rousseau says these are the sweetest sentiments known to man. So at this point, you have these very sort of distinctively human, and Rousseau says very sweet experiences, passions, sentiments, love for somebody else, love for your children, and yet you don't have most of the negative things of society. You don't yet have the total loss of natural freedom. You don't have inequality. You don't have people having to work for somebody else just to support themselves. So this, you can see why Rousseau says this is the best. You have the best things of settled life, of communal life, basically conjugal love, paternal love, and yet none of the negatives yet. Now, you do start to get into some problems here, though. Along with this is all good, Rousseau says, but we'll see a couple of things. But one of the first thing he points out, one of the first problems he points out, is that now people began to sort of basically create luxuries, things that they didn't really need, that they had never had in the state of nature, and these became yokes, as he puts it, kind of chains, things that actually became the ways of imprisoning them. So as he says at the top of page 113 of this translation, he says, so they had these luxuries. He says they were yokes for them, and the first source of the evils they prepared for their descendants. And as he puts it, for not only did such commodities continue to soften both body and mind, they almost lost through habitual use their power to please, as they had at the same time degenerated into actual needs. Being deprived of them became much more cruel than the possession of them was sweet. And people were unhappy in losing them without being happy in possessing them. So Rousseau says these luxuries now, people began to have these things that they didn't really need, and yet as they started to become used to them, they became actual needs. So they weren't needs naturally, but as people started to have them, so let's say that they, through cooperation, they began to constantly have coconuts. So the sweetness of the coconut, Rousseau says, became a luxury, but then one that people actually came to need. And yet they basically sort of, because it became a need, because they became sort of so used to it, they began to, in a sense, take it for granted, that basically they enjoyed it much less than they did in the state of nature, when occasionally they would come upon a coconut, eat it, and enjoy it. Now it became an actual need, and if for some reason they were deprived of it, Rousseau says it would actually be worse. It would be unpleasant for them, and yet it was far worse for them to lose that luxury than it was. They had far more pain in losing the luxury than they ever had pleasure in enjoying it. So we can take a more recent example. I drink coffee. Most of the time when I'm drinking coffee, I'm thinking about something else. I'm barely even aware of the taste or the flavor or anything like that. So I don't actually get that much enjoyment out of coffee. And yet if for some reason I couldn't drink it anymore, I would consider that to be some kind of deprivation. I would miss it. I would think it was unfortunate that I couldn't drink it, not just because I need the caffeine. Even if I were, wean myself off of the caffeine or whatever, I would think it was really bad that I couldn't enjoy coffee anymore. And yet, on a day-to-day basis, again, I'm barely even aware of the coffee that I drink. So that's what Rousseau says happens through habitual use. These things lose their actual pleasure, their actual exciting character, and yet you also become reliant on them. So on the one hand, as they become less and less enjoyable, less and less pleasant, you also become more and more, in a sense, really sort of dependent on them. And therefore, when you lose them, Rousseau says, it's a very painful, unfortunate thing, and yet you didn't even enjoy it that much. So Rousseau says that's why they become yokes. Luxuries become like yokes, like chains, things that you rely on, and yet don't even give you that much pleasure anymore. So he sort of, sees that's one of the problems with this development of this stage of nature. As he goes on, he says common life leads to the further development of language. Remember, he said it's very hard to figure out where language comes from, how it would have developed in the state of nature. But he says, people living together, it's easy to see how they would have started to develop language a little bit more. And then as he sort of sketches what society would have been like here. And so as this happens, as people are living together, their language is developing, they're communicating more. So he says at this point a somewhat more self-conscious attraction and love develops. As he puts it, people become accustomed to judging different objects and to making comparisons. Gradually they acquire ideas of merit and of beauty, which in turn produce feelings of preference. So as people live together, they start to talk and so on, they begin to actually make distinctions among different things and among different people. And they start to think that this person is more beautiful than this person is more attractive than this person. And therefore particular attachments, particular preferences form. And from that, Rousseau says, you also have jealousy. So once people really start to become attached to this person rather than anybody else, one of the inevitable or just necessary side effects, or even just the other side of the same coin, is jealousy. As you become attached to one person and attracted only to that person, you also become jealous if other people are also attracted to them. I mean, you might say, well, you could, not know. You don't need to be jealous if you know that they feel the same way about you and so on. But Rousseau is saying you can't have that kind of particular attachment without wanting that person, and therefore jealousy comes along, and as Rousseau says, it claims its first victims. As he puts it, the gentlest of passions receives the sacrifice of human blood. So Rousseau says there were conflicts over one person, and therefore people would fight and kill each other. So even though he says there are these, as he puts it, the sweetest sentiments known to man, conjugal love and paternal love, and yet at the same time that also means jealousy, and jealousy means conflict and even deadly conflict. So Rousseau sees for every advance, for every good thing that comes along, there's also a price to pay. And the basic price, if you put it in the most general terms, is the loss of our natural freedom. And that's what happens throughout as he sketches these different aspects of this early society. You have this happening again and again. People begin to care what other people think of them. Whether it's an actual sort of romantic or passionate attachment to someone else in the form of love, or whether it's just concern for what other people think of them, for how other people appraise them in this situation. He talks about how they begin to dance and sing, and they start to think some people are better looking or stronger or better dancers or so on. People become concerned with the opinion of other people. And therefore they're sort of beginning to lose that natural freedom, but it's still a relatively mild loss, and Rousseau says overall it's better. You may lose some natural freedom through love. You become attached to one person, you can't simply walk away anymore because you want to be with them, but Rousseau says overall the good things about love, the sweetness of love is far outweighs the relatively small loss of natural freedom. And yet at the same time he says, there is conflict, there is bloodshed. Love is sweet, but it's impossible without jealousy, or without at least the possibility of jealousy, and therefore conflict, and therefore again, murder, blood is shed, and so on. Again, he says now that they have some leisure, now that they're living together, dancing and singing become frequent occupations, and therefore again, the idea of comparing people begins to develop. People began to make comparisons between different individuals. They think this person is a better dancer, this person is better looking, this person is stronger. He even says maybe people thought one person was more eloquent than another, which is again a very basic form of eloquence, obviously. But he says, these comparisons start to happen, and he says, and then people got very touchy. And so he says, as soon as people began to do this, to make these comparisons, they also began to become very easily offended and feel as if they were somehow being slighted if somebody didn't think as well of them as they thought that they deserved. So as he says at the bottom of page 114, as soon as men learned to value one another and the idea of consideration was formed in their mind, so again, once they come together, and now they're no longer just engaging in this minor cooperation for things, but they actually begin to value each other as individuals. And therefore they value their opinion, they value whether or not they are valued in return. So they begin to become somewhat dependent on other people, on other people's judgments of them. So he says, as soon as men learned to value one another and the idea of consideration was formed in their minds, everyone claimed a right to it, and it was no longer possible for anyone to be refused consideration without affront. This gave rise to the first duties of civility, even among savages, and henceforth every intentional wrong became an outrage, because together with the hurt which might result from the injury, the offended party saw an insult to his person which was often more unbearable than the hurt itself. So he says, therefore you had to begin to have the development of civility. If somebody felt insulted, they would get very angry, and oftentimes the sort of affront to their pride was much worse than any insult, any actual damage they may have suffered. So here people begin to become somewhat like Hobbes describes them. Very vainglorious, very touchy, have an extremely high opinion of themselves. They get angry when other people don't seem to share that high opinion. And yet inevitably people don't, because everybody thinks highly of themselves, and therefore you have a bunch of sort of egomaniacs going around expecting everybody else to think that they're the most important person in the world, which isn't going to happen because each person thinks that that they themselves are the most important person in the world. And Rousseau that's sort of some of what you have here, what Rousseau is describing, that you have some of this where you have people again very easily offended. They want to be honored by other people. Everybody sort of overrates their own qualities, their own physical attractiveness, their own ability to dance, their own ability to speak, and therefore if they're slighted in some way, Rousseau says again, sometimes they became violent. Therefore you had to have the creation of a very primitive, very rudimentary form of civility, ways of showing respect to people and making them feel that they're being honored, even if you don't think that they're as good as somebody else. So, Rousseau kind of returns to the idea, natural man harms no one, is incapable of being offended. By now, people are removed enough from the state of nature that they can feel offense. And yet, overall, he says this was, in fact, the best and the happiest state for humanity. This is the one we should have stayed at. Yes, there was some violence, there was some conflict through jealousy, through being offended, but Rousseau says overall this was sort of the golden mean. The golden mean between, as he puts it, in the middle of page 115. Thus, although men had come to have less fortitude, and their natural pity had suffered some dilution, this period of the development of human faculties, the golden mean between the indolence of the primitive state and the petulant activity of our own pride, must have been the happiest epoch and the most lasting. So he says this was the happiest, and notice that there's sort of this inverse relationship between natural pity and pride. Now that we live in society, now that we have some sense of ourselves as individuals, and we all have some sense of how to make judgments, make evaluations, to say this is better than this, our pride begins to grow, and as our pride grows, our natural pity is, as he puts it, diluted, but not completely. That we still have enough natural pity, and we have enough good things in life now that this is, as he puts it, the golden mean between the indolence and the sort of animal nature of natural humanity and the petulance of our own pride, which has fully taken over our lives in civil society, in this final stage that he'll talk about later. So he says this was the happiest, the most lasting. He says we can see this, that really if we had wanted to be happy, we should have stayed here forever. And he has another footnote, another important footnote, where he talks about all kinds of examples of how savages, people, again, by savages he doesn't mean anything negative, but people who are living in what he thinks is this sort of intermediate state between the state of nature and between civil society. In his own day, he thought most of the people outside of Europe and outside of the sort of older civilizations in the Middle East and India and China and so on, most of the people who were encountered in the New World and in much of sub-Saharan Africa, he thought were still living pretty much in this condition. And he said, in a lot of the Pacific Islands as well and so on, and he said, you can never get them to actually adopt the life of a European. To them it's ridiculous and obviously doesn't make them happy, whereas he says Europeans who go there as missionaries, as travelers or whatever, oftentimes come to adopt their way of life and actually like it quite a bit. They really prefer living there, and if they are missionaries and for some reason they're called back to Europe, they're usually very unhappy, and they remember very pleasantly how great it was to live like that, to live in a way that was much more natural and therefore better. And they're unhappy and sad when they have to return to European society and live in this world of pride and falseness and so on. So he says, this is the best and the happiest state for humanity. This sort of first stage of communal life, this second stage in human history as a whole, this intermediate stage between the state of nature and fully developed civil society which includes law and private property and all of this. And so how did this happen? And he says he sort of explains that as long as people lived this way and just did their own work, or only momentarily or briefly cooperated or collaborated for things, then all of this was fine. This could continue. They could continue to live this way as long as they were relatively free in that way. The problem was when they began to undertake much larger enterprises, much larger projects that required a kind of permanent or at least ongoing dependence of one person on another. That was sort of the fatal moment in human development, which led eventually then to the creation of private property and then ultimately the creation of civil society. So as he puts it at the top of page 116, again, as long as people were able to work as an individual, they could remain free. But as he puts it, from the instant one man needed the help of another, and it was found to be useful for one man to have provisions enough for two, equality disappeared, property was introduced, work became necessary, and vast forests were transformed into pleasant fields, which had to be watered with the sweat of men, and where slavery and misery were soon seen to germinate and flourish with the crops. Again, another great rhetorical flourish by Rousseau. Basically says, again, once people came to rely on each other, that changed everything. People lost their natural freedom, and they had to sort of again then become dependent on other people, and that was sort of the end of this sort of golden age, this best stage, this best period of human existence, and that's what he'll describe in the following in the next section of part 2.